All right, first of all, I'd like to thank my electives department for allowing me to speak today on behalf of myself and the school that the program that I'm working in right now. I'd like to, what was that?
You owe us.
I owe you. Very sorry. Well, I'll be more than happy to listen to anything you need to present for whatever purposes you need to present.
Thank you.
First of all, the class that I'm in right now is on multicultural education and talks a lot about disparities between different multicultural groups and in education and such, and the concerns of such things. And today I'm going to be presenting on one of the subjects that came up. And last week I was trying to figure out what subject I was going to present on, and the solution came to me in class because I found that I had a student who was out of my class on Friday, and he was going to be out of my class on Monday as well, named Calvin Wyrick. And you would know him because he's a 7th grader, and you guys are all electives teachers, so he's my student at the moment. But I got a call from the RC asking me, which is the Responsibility Center, asking me if he could go ahead and come into my class because he was concerned that he wasn't going to be able to get his Pinewood Derby card done in time for my class, which is due this Thursday. And I told them, go ahead and let him come in. I promise I'll make sure he doesn't talk to anybody. I'll make sure he's isolated. I'll make sure that and if he starts talking to people, I'll send him back to the RC. RC then called me back to tell me I checked with the office and we can't send him. They don't want him going to class. And so that was on Friday, and so over the weekend I'm thinking about this and I'm reading the textbook and such, and it really kind of irks me the notion that here's this kid who's a little behind in my class, wants to be in my class, wants to be catching up in my class, and he's not in my class, and they can't let him go into my class, and I can't send my work off to the RC for him to work because it's woodworking and he can't be using files and creating sawdust in the shop, so he's just basically out of luck and he's out of my class. And this concerns me, and it comes up in the discussion in the book about disparities, about suspensions. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about suspensions and whether or not, actually I already have that up on the book, suspensions and whether or not they really serve the purposes that we want them to serve, and whether they are a useful solution to the problems that we have on campus, or whether or not they are adding to the problem and potentially making things less even for different populations on the campus and such. And that's what my presentation is on today. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Pulling kids out of class. In fact, I was just talking to Merrill about this, because I find myself asking all sorts of people on campus about Wyrick, because Wyrick's in my head, and I can't stop thinking about this kid and what I can do to try to help this kid do well. And the reality is he does well in my class, and he's paying attention to my class, and he's doing well in my class and such. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on with him. But I was talking to Merrill about the on-campus suspensions, and she was very passionate about the notion that they are not doing what they need to be doing. They're not good for the kids. What they do is they pull the kids out of our classes so that they are farther behind in our class. And then these kids are already having difficulties in our class, most likely because of behavior issues they're having in our class. They're already more likely to be behind, and now they're even further behind. And then at some point they give up on catching up, and they don't bother even trying, because what's the point? Sooner or later they're going to be pulled out again, and they're going to miss more class, and they're not going to hit the due date that we're trying to get them to get to, because they keep getting pulled out of class. And what's the point? If the school doesn't want them in class, why are they even here in the first place? And this leads them later on in life to just give up on the whole thing and just zone out, and they're the ones that are dropping out of school. Like, quite often, these are not equitable across the way. So having kids pulled out of class seems kind of, honestly, it seems a little bit kind of not really matching the situation. In relation to this young man, Mr. Wyrick, he was bullying kids across campus, and because of that, he is pulled out of my class. So he's not able to learn the things that I wanted to learn in my class, all because he's bullying kids across campus. And it brings up the question of, does that really serve our purposes, and is that a good thing? What do you guys think in terms of what are your thoughts on suspensions and whether or not it serves the purpose that we want? Does it seem like it's a necessary evil, or do you think that there's other solutions, or what do you think is the possibility? Anything you want to throw out here?
Is that a rhetorical question?
No, it's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually...
If it's something, I mean, clearly if somebody is bullying someone else, there has to be some consequence.
Absolutely.
And it has to be, the students have to understand that it's a serious consequence.
Sure.
certainly agree with the problem of once they're out of the class, that it exacerbates a problem. Do you have any other solutions other than suspension for a kid who's bullying? I mean, there's gotta be a strong reaction.
And it comes down to the teacher. How much do we want to, as a staff, how do we want to approach this problem? We can go the route where suspension, or we can come and provide
What?
another kind of program,
What?
another intervention.
What?
Well,
That's the discussion we have to
that's what
open.
needs to be done. Here on campus at Centerville, when we first started, we had a student peer-based system that was not exclusive, but inclusive, where students were a part of the decision-making for students who were making bad choices on campus. At this age, peer-level judgment, peer-level input is the most important factor in the students' decisions, right? So why not have the punishment include peers?
As in have the students come up with
Have the
potential
students
solutions?
be a part of the panel that is discussing this. We as adults have to do our job, and what I agree with in terms of Francisco, so what I would send a student to RC for would not be the same reason somebody else would. And in my class, because it's an art, theater, language arts, there's a different process that occurs where students are already vulnerable because they're emotionally open at times.
Yes.
So because of that, they're held accountable, and I see them holding each other accountable for small infractions, right? You shouldn't be doing that. So it makes a difference when the kids say it, and I'm not the one saying it. So even in small steps, I see it. Why not return to a peer-mediated group that is helping to keep the kids in the class?
What would and this is a peer-mediated group that would come up with other types of decisions regarding discipline and such. I note, in my mind, I think there's a slight difference between a teacher sending a student out to the RC. I always vote for the RC myself, because I feel it makes a big difference for me to be able to send out a student if I'm having difficulty with them, so I get back to my classroom. I think that it may or may not be appropriate for the office to be using the RC as a way to punish, go off there for 2 days and such. I know that we're supposed to, by the way, be giving them work in class.
Right.
But when a student misbehaves somewhere completely out of my class, has nothing to do with my class, and is then out of my class, I kind of feel like there's a disconnect.
On the other hand, if their misbehavior is during lunch or an outside time,
There needs to be a
then,
consequence.
then all of us, it doesn't matter where.
Where it stems from.
Yeah, and especially with something like bullying. So what kind of consequence, if we did include kids in the decision-making process, what kind of consequence is still a potential consequence for something like that?
We could be all creative.
You
Well,
could have
like-
him, if he's bullying, he could be writing letters to the students
You
apologizing.
could be doing presentations in front of, addressing it, because there's multiple people involved. There's the bystanders, there's the bully, the victim, there's multiple groups.
So could we, I mean, you're thinking that, let's say that the student is bullying somebody in PE, that they stand up in front of the PE class and give a presentation,
Or
or
write
what's
letters,
your vision?
an apology to the,
Like I said, if the peers come up with it, it's often better. I feel like that's extreme. That is extreme.
Yeah, it's to me
But
too.
that's because that's me. But I grew up like that. When we had an infraction in our family and there were 7 kids. we had
that
to-
plays
There
very
was
well
a-
into the next aspect of this.
Okay.
And as this is the 20 to 30 minute video, I should get moving on.
Yeah.
No, this is very good discussion, I think this is important. It has become abundantly clear that African American and Hispanic students are far more likely to be given a suspension than their white classmates. Research also shows that the trend is getting worse, and I'll go ahead and show the next slide before we address. This is a quote from a researcher in 2008. Nationally, the African Americans, which I added in because of the word they, are 3 times more likely than non-black students to be suspended or expelled for the same offenses. The problem has gotten worse, not better. In 1972, black students were suspended at just twice the rate of other students. What reasons do we, I talked to Ray because I wanted to really fully understand what's going on with wiring. So yesterday I talked to Ray, and
What race is Wyrick?
Wyrick's black.
Okay.
And I asked him, you know, first of all, I talked to Wyrick. I said, you know, what's going on? Why did this happen? What do you think is going on here? And why do you think that this happened? And he gave me a much diluted version of what Ray gave me. And Ray gave me a much more severe version where he's bullying lots of people on campus. And various parents have written letters and called the school to complain that he's picking on them. He apparently is using the N-word flagrantly around campus all over the place, which he mentioned to me, but he said, you know, I use the N-word, but I didn't really, you know, I don't even really know why I did or whatever. So he's got language issues that he's saying, and he's being particularly mean to kids in general. Mr. Haratani, his case manager, was saying yesterday he was coming to school and he was intentionally bumping into kids as he was coming along. So Wyrick's certainly got quite a bit of issues to go along here, but why would you imagine, and I asked Ray, that's right, I was going into this, I asked Ray whether or not he was, as he was obviously aware of this as a phenomenon, that the minorities are more likely to find themselves in the RC. Ray admitted that on this campus there are definitely higher rates of minorities, Hispanics, and blacks that are in the RC than the white kids on campus. He suggested some reasons behind that. He suggested that he thinks that it's not as high as the national average on this campus, the disparity. He suggested, when I asked him why do you imagine that is, he suggested that that a lot of kids are brought in from Oakland, and that they're leaving their own district to come here most likely because they're having problems, and of those students that get brought in from Oakland, they're more likely to be African American. And they're also, he suggested that they're more likely to be raised by single parents, grandparents. There's a lot of kids that are being raised by their grandparents and single parents and such, and they're also more likely to be poor, and these aspects contribute to that. Do we imagine? I have a theory based on some reading that I've been doing of other reasons why I think this might be an issue. Do you have any ideas as to yourself as to why you imagine you might be more likely to land in the suspended if you're Asian or if you're African American or Hispanic?
There are a lot.
There are
A lot of
A
reasons.
lot of factors.
A lot of reasons that could go on for a very long time.
Yeah.
That's
No.
a long discussion.
Okay, well, let me suggest something that I have come up with, and we can discuss that narrowly instead. There's also, that's
Oh, busted.
busted. Well, it is after school. I'm gonna hang up on Jake. There are a lot of reasons why, and one reason that I'm wondering is the textbook brings up the subject that different cultures live differently and have different personalities in their home. They live in different environments where they behave in different ways. As an example, apparently Puerto Rican students, when they don't understand what's going on, they learn through culture to wrinkle their nose. And that apparently is some sort of sign of not understanding what they're talking, what's going on. I think it's Puerto Rican. In Hawaiian cultures, Native American cultures, from what I'm reading in the textbook, they are not wanting to be very competitive with each other, so they're more likely to work better in collaborative groups. Okay? And I wonder whether or not different cultural aspects of the kids' lives that they grow up with and live with. You were mentioning a moment ago of what it's like to grow up in an African American family, right? It's different than what it's like to grow up in a white family or an Asian family. Asians, quite often, some Asian populations do pretty well in our society, and it's suggested that's because their culture matches very nicely with the school environment of the United States, and the way they are taught to behave works very well with the teachers, the American teachers, and they tend to see positively on the way that the average, or that a lot of Asians, different Asian cultures, some Asian cultures do well, by the way, some Asian cultures don't necessarily do well, so it's not blanket about Asian. But I'm wondering whether or not part of Wyrick's issue is, because day one in my class, he was really boisterous and loud, and just outspoken and really was not quiet at all. And nowadays, I'm starting to think maybe this is because it's the environment that he grew up in. Maybe he was used to, as a child and as a young man, around people and an environment where it was expected / he got used to the notion of just really being you got something to say, say it. And then he arrives on a campus where you've got something to say it doesn't really work because teachers are constantly wanting you to quiet down, and that may be hard for him to do. So the question becomes, do you think that that could be part of the problem why we're having issues with disparities in, yes?
So are you suggesting that, I don't know where Wyrick was in school before this year, you said he's a
He's
seventh
local. I
grader.
asked Mr. Harkani, he's
So
local.
are you thinking that in his previous classrooms, that that it was okay to do that?
I don't think previous classrooms, I think previous environments that he spends a large chunk of his day, maybe at home, maybe around his friends, the kids that he hangs out with after school. We hear that he uses the N-word quite a bit on campus. Maybe everybody he knows that he hangs out with and spends all of his time with, maybe they use the word commonly. Maybe it's just kind of a random thing for him and he's used to it, and he has lived a life that has made this kind of his personality, and that has led him to be, to some extent, who he is today. Yes?
First, I want to address
Sure.
that I didn't distinguish between being raised in a white home or a black home. It was
Oh.
more about status for the way we were raised,
Oh,
and
okay.
the cultural significance to being shamed in the family. We were faith-based. Religious that was about culture.
Sure.
We are
Well,
many
Right,
religion,
right.
religion is
This is
part of
what
your culture
religion-
though, right?
Yes, but I'm many cultures.
Sure.
And a lot of it has been ingrained. And when I say many cultures, I'm of a mixed ethnicity, so I
Okay.
have some Caribbean culture traditions that stick
Sure.
with the family. I have some very, very Irish traditions that stick with the family and have been passed on. So culturally, I'm American.
Mhm.
But
Ethnically,
religiously.
I am a multicultural person. The punishments that were handed down were mostly faith-based. It wasn't about how the Trinidadians behaved or the Colombians, how they behaved. It was how my father was raised. My father stepped outside of a non-traditional, they didn't believe in a God. My father believed in God, so he raised his family, the 7 of us.
They
His
being, I'm
siblings-
sorry, they didn't believe in
His
God.
siblings and
His
his
si-
parents.
Oh, okay,
He
so,
brought God into their
Okay,
lives
sure.
too. So it was really different than the way they were raised.
sure.
Your
So
punishments being faith-based,
we're
when you,
faith-based.
I'm not sure what you mean by
Yeah, I'm
that.
not sure what you meant by that either.
You read the Bible, and the things that you were told to do in the Bible, you pass on to your children.
But I mean,
You shall not lie,
punishments.
and if you lie, you will stand in front of the congregation and tell them that you lied. You will apologize to the congregation. So those kinds of behaviors were practiced in my home as well. If you commit a sin, you repeat the sin. It was,
But it's also important,
Own it,
important to
you
know,
own it, right?
you own it, and
Yeah.
that was culturally American during that time for many groups of color. It wasn't just black.
sure,
There were people in the status group that I grew up in.
it's also good to point out the fact that just because two kids look almost exactly the same,
But they
doesn't
don't
mean they
belong
live the
together.
same lives or that they have the same
Yeah,
experiences.
because of ethnic, yeah.
But a lot of ethnicities do share some commonalities.
Yeah,
But no two kids are going to live the same life. As it also pointed out in my textbook, two brothers can be just completely different and lives.
the other component, I think, is that we as a system do not discuss it. There's no discourse about the atrocities that are being practiced on minority groups in this country. So it's getting worse because statistically, there's no
Hiding from
conversation.
it.
Yeah, there's no conversation to address it. And I've never believed in putting things on the back burner and not discussing them. To resolve it, you gotta.
Yeah, we're doing that a lot nationally these days. People just want to ignore things.
Well,
And
that's.
you can go ahead and do that on your own as
what I'm
long as it doesn't
saying.
come into the public
Yeah.
discussion. All right, we should
That's part of it too.
move along.
You-
And I thank you very
I
much.
would like to,
I know.
Okay, go
Don, I
ahead.
would like to continue this
Yeah.
later on. I think it's
This
an
actually-
important discussion to have.
This comes up into what you were just saying as well, to some extent, in the sense that many teachers in schools attempt to be colorblind by saying that they don't acknowledge race at all, and they just say, I don't see race, I just see students, which is to basically suggest that if you treat everybody exactly the same, then that is equitable and fair, and that's not necessarily always true. Or it could potentially be considered not fair because of what people bring to their classes. It ends up not being fair if people bring different things to the classroom, but you treat them all exactly the same. Like, for instance, if you expect everyone to look you in the eye when you're talking to them, some cultures it's not okay to look your teacher in the eye, and so if you expect everybody to look you in the eye, only the kids that have been taught by their parents and grandparents and such to not look kids in the eye, they're the ones getting in trouble. Okay? But we also have a staff meeting, so I need to move on with the conversation. I wish we could take longer for this.
Oh, don't worry.
I have the last couple slides here talks about things that I have that I've seen or that I've read about in terms of things that we could potentially do to try to help our students stay out of the RC and stay out of suspension. And the article which I'm going to give you today at the end of the thing talks about at one point making an active effort to learn about the backgrounds and cultures of our students. And this seemed rather daunting to me first. I'm thinking I've got 20 different cultures in my classroom and 20 different groups of students and such. And I recognize that learning about Hispanics doesn't mean I'm learning about this person, Luce's life.
Right.
But to learn more about the Hispanic culture might make me more likely to understand more of my Hispanic students and what they and the way they behave and the way they act and what's going on with them. And it seemed rather daunting until it occurred to me that I teach a new semester every semester. So if I choose one right now, and if I were to take some time to learn about that culture a little bit more, maybe find a student that I get along with really well and talk to them and try to learn more about the Hispanic culture and different aspects of the Hispanic culture, and then for the rest of my teaching career I'll be a little bit more knowledgeable about that. If we just choose to ignore everybody's ethnicity and not learn about them, then it may not be the best example. So I'm thinking I'm going to try to learn a little bit about a different culture each semester to try to, 10 years from now, I should be much better at recognizing things that are happening in a student's life that may tie into their culture. And if I know more about my students, then I can try to find ways to use their cultural differences as an asset rather than as a difficulty to overcome. And that is my last slide, I believe. I want to go to, nope. One last aspect is to, I was just talking to Louisa here, that I'm amazed at how much my classes are improving year to year to year. And I think it's because the more I know what I'm doing, the more I expect them to do well. Because I know that I'm going to tell you everything you need to do to do this. And so I expect more out of them. And I think it's more that I expect so much more of them this year than I did 3 years ago, that they are giving me so much more. So I think that we as one aspect of a way to keep our kids engaged and keep them excited about class is to make them believe that they can. And I was telling that boy today, I said, you can do this, you will do this, you will focus, you will sit down. Because he was just not putting very much effort. I said, no, you will focus, you can do this, you will be success, we will make this work. And I sat down and I just really got to make sure, hopefully we as a group can make our kids really believe they can be successful. And if they feel that we have confidence in them, they're more likely to listen to us and more likely to want to do well in our class, and more likely to want to stay in our classes. Okay? All right, I think my last slide is a thank you slide. And I will say thank you very much for letting me present. I know that I opened a giant can of worms and that we don't really have time to talk about the entire, it's a good can of worms for us to talk about.
Worms feed the soil, don't forget.
And as it brings up such a great subject for that we could talk about in the future, I am going to ask you to take one of these packets and perhaps read it over sometime over the next month, and perhaps we can revisit this discussion next month and maybe in future staff meetings. All right?
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.